So in our next video, we're going to take an overview of various components related to communication, and we've identified some that we think are significant. Our first would be communication foundation. Then we're going to look at communication style preferences. We'll look at communication processing skills and listening strengths. And then finally, we'll look at people's capability to provide communication feedback. In this first section on communication foundation, you can see that we've got our scales of extroversion and introversion. And we can see that our group as a whole is not particularly extroverted, aside from member B, who is. And we can see that there is a tendency towards introversion, and certainly member C is the most introverted of the bunch. Now, from a team interaction standpoint, I don't think that that's particularly critical. Again, it depends on the nature of the work that they're doing, but we need to realize that B is going to be much more outgoing than the rest of the group, and probably very different than member C. But I don't think that that's a big problem. People just need to be aware. They're aware anyways, but they need to be aware of the differences and then just adapt to the differences in how they interact with each other and interrelate. Where it does become significant is in the environmental factors, and we say, well, our preference of the majority of our group is more of an introverted environment where there may not be as much interaction, there may not be as much dealings with the public, or not an open environment, closed door environment to a certain extent, so people can work in relation to their personal preference. That being the case, let's assume that this environment is a quieter, introverted environment. That's going to demotivate member B because they need to have their external extroverted outlets, and they're going to be demotivated if they're not allowed to do that. Similarly, if it was a very open environment, noisy, busy, interaction with a lot of people, perhaps external people coming in all the time, that could go against the preferences of our introverted people, and that could affect their motivation and their performance. We can also look at a number of different ways that people communicate as a whole. An overview, I guess, would be the best way to put it. And here we've identified idea exchange, intellectual competitiveness, confrontational communication, and supportive communication. And what we mean by this is, from an idea exchange, what we're seeing is that members B and E tend to be more interested in sharing ideas, communicating ideas to other people. They're not extremely high on that score, but they're higher, obviously, than the other group. That is a little bit more communicative than the average population, but comparatively they're lower. Again, it depends on the role, how much communication is required in their specific work activities. But similarly, in a group interaction situation, we probably see these two members being the more outgoing in a team meeting, for example, than the rest of the group. And it's important for a manager to understand that and say, how do we bring out these people, because the environment could be dominated a little bit by these. When we look at competitive communication, this isn't particularly crucial. It goes somewhat in line with when we looked at competitive in another chart. Overly competitive communication is not going to occur in this group. They tend to be less competitive, and even member D would be the most competitive. And this would be, again, leading towards debates, discussions, disagreements with other people, but it's not a significant factor at all. And of course, we can see that A is not going to get into a lot of competitive debates. Communication, confrontational communication, we can see that B would be more likely to confront others in how they communicate, and D and E are less likely to. Now, we see a lot of people typically in this area. A lot of managers don't like to confront other people. This is relatively healthy, because what that's saying is that people will not be taken advantage of. The B would be the least likely to be taken advantage of. So if they're in a team leader role or a managerial role, they're the ones that will say you're coming in late, or you're not, living up to your responsibilities as a lot quicker than D and E. It'll take them a little time to get to that point where they're going to confront. Again, when we relate this to other behavioral characteristics, what we would be concerned about is somebody with low behavior control being very high on this scale. That's the person who's going to be very confrontational in the workplace and anti-productive and demotivating. Finally, when we look at supportive communication, this is either supportive among your team members or other employees, or even in your work where you're advising and helping people externally to the organization. We can see our people in general are very supportive in their communication, and the only one that possibly would be of concern would be member D. Now, this can indicate that member D doesn't need supportive communication, so doesn't understand the potential need of the other people around them to have that. So from a managerial perspective, it's important to create that awareness and say, well, member D, just because you don't require that in your workplace doesn't mean that the people around you don't. And so be aware of that, get your radar up, and be willing to provide supportive communication to the people around you in the event that you detect that would be beneficial to their performance. There are any number of ways that we can identify and categorize communication preferences. For us, this is a method that's worked well for us over the years, and we tend to rely on it most often. Here, what we're interested in is how do people prefer to receive communication? Do they prefer to receive it in visual, auditory, or kinesthetic terms? Then how do they prefer to process the information that they receive? Do they prefer to process it in serial, sequential, step-by-step ways, or are they more random in their processing preferences? And then finally, how do they prefer to express themselves in either visual, auditory, or kinesthetic terms? Again, we can get some group preferences, but they're not as informative and as valuable as when we get individual preferences. We can see that our group as a whole would prefer to receive their communication either in visual or auditory terms, and there is an element that they will prefer to receive it in kinesthetic terms, but we know safely, and it's just similar to the general population, that the great majority of people either prefer auditory or visual communication, and in either format we're going to be fine with this group of people. It gets interesting when we look at how they prefer to process information, and here we can see that A, C, and D all like to process their information in a step-by-step sequential fashion, whereas B and E prefer to process their information in more random terms. And here we can start to look back at the other characteristics that we evaluated. So we can say that when we refer back to our thinking preferences, that people would prefer to think in either sequential or random terms. And we can cross-reference our people here and say, is it the case that A, C, and D, because they prefer to think sequentially, and they may also prefer, or from a motivational aspect, be very procedural in their motivation, therefore their communication tends to be follow that type of format, whereas B and E may prefer more random thinking, may prefer more of an options-oriented motivational environment, and be more able to communicate in abstract terms. Certainly, we see that from E, as we recall that E was moving up fairly high in abstract thinking. And so we can make those initial correlations. What's most important for us from a performance standpoint is self-awareness at the first stage. So we want people to understand how they prefer to receive, process, and give information. And that's wonderful, because once that is accomplished, then they're more able to categorize the person that they're providing the information to. So it's not particularly your preferences in getting your message out there. It's going to be most effective when you understand the receipt and processing preferences of the person that you're talking to. So if you know that person A prefers to receive their information in either visually or auditory terms, that's fine, but they want to have it presented to them in a step-by-step, we're going to do this, then this type of process. And if you understand that, you can communicate more directly and more effectively with that person. And if you understand that person B is a little bit different, then you can adapt your communication to them. So therefore, we come back to, again, another of the characteristics that we were looking at before, which I mentioned was flexibility, the ability to adapt to changing situations. And that's going to be important here from a communication aspect as well. If you know that people require different communication input and processing help, then you can adapt your communication delivery to be most effective to them. And this is what it's all about, whether from a leadership perspective or a management perspective or a team interaction perspective. It really isn't about you. It's about your effectiveness in getting your message across to that other person, and your flexibility in being able to adapt to the different needs of the people that you're dealing with. So in this section, we're going to look at communication from two aspects. So first is communication process skills, and the second are people's capability to listen. From the aspect of communication process, what we've done is we're basically saying there's basic steps in a communication interaction. And we can identify then strengths and weaknesses in those specific steps, and also get an overall impression of their ability to go through this communication process. So if we identify our steps, the first would be the planning of the message. The second would be creating a clear, well-crafted message. The third would be choosing the right channel in which to communicate. The fourth would be decoding what the other person has said to you once you receive the message from them. And then the last would be providing feedback to that person based on what you've heard. And so we can see that on average our people are pretty strong communicators. We've got our blue line with the red numbers that shows that typically they're above average compared to many people. That said, of the bunch, we could see automatically that member E tends to be the strongest communicator of the bunch based on these criteria, and member A could possibly use some overall communication work, but it's not terrible. Now, that being said, top performers are always looking for ways to improve their performance, and they could see that there could be some overall developmental programs that could help everybody elevate their performance to a certain extent. Or we can look at it from the aspect of, are there things that we should be doing with member A in order to bring them up in their communication capabilities as well. But overall, we've got a pretty good group of communicators on basis of the process. Then when we look at listening strengths, we can see we've identified our team from a different way. And so we've got strengths in preparing to listen, active listening, and then empathetic listening. And this is very important, and a lot of us are not particularly good listeners, especially when it comes to active listening, and we can see our team in that case drops down a little bit there. All of them are very good at the preparation side of getting ready to hear what needs to be heard, but they decline a little bit when we look at their capability to actively listening. And that's, think of it this way, that a lot of people will tend to try to think about what they're going to say in response halfway through the communication process, so they're not fully listening, they're not fully paying attention to what the other person is saying, and this can cause some communication problems or misunderstandings. And in that case, what we can see is the best of the bunch with that would be member E, and we might want to do some work with A, B, and D on active listening. Empathetic listening, which is really the ability to empathize with the other person, to care about what they're saying, and certainly is very important from a managerial and leadership standpoint to understand how the other person is and the impact that would have on the communication that they're feeding back to you is very important as well. So again, we can see that from Team dynamic, we need to create a better listening environment from a manager and leadership dynamic, I think as well, that this would be an area that we could identify some developmental work in. So in our final chart related to our communication video, it's a little bit specialized, and it is somewhat of an extension beyond what we saw in the previous chart where we talked about communication feedback, and now what we're doing is we're starting to identify some key components of that. In here, what we're talking about is a person's ability to provide or prepare to provide feedback, how good they are at structuring feedback in a way that will balance both negative and positive reactions to the feedback. Their ability to link line management with strategic management, their ability to place their feedback in the proper context so that the recipient will accept it and it's going to be better received, and then how well they are at following up on the feedback that they're given from a performance management standpoint. And so again, we can see that our team is fairly good at providing feedback, as was indicated before. And we know that in general terms, member B and member E tend to have better capabilities when they're providing feedback. So from across the board, we say, well, perhaps we might need to work with our group in follow-up and in linking line and strategic management together when it's related to feedback, and also when they're structuring feedback in order that it's well received. Perhaps there's ways that we can look at it to make it more positive rather than a negative interaction with the people receiving it, so that it's not taken in an unproductive and in a way that will negate people performing in the way that we want them to perform. What is interesting to me is this one element of feedback where we see a general tendency for our people not to make that connection and to provide that feedback either downstream or upstream between strategy and line management. And this is very important from an organizational internal communication process, that everybody needs to be better at communicating back their understanding of either the strategic direction or the challenges that perhaps the line management levels would have with the strategic direction. So there's somewhat of a dysfunction here that from a leadership managerial vision aspect that might concern me a little bit, and certainly would be something to discuss. What it could indicate is just a lack of fully understanding the direction and the issues that may occur in the direction. And so that needs to be addressed in order that everybody is on the same page. Other than that, we can all improve on our ability to provide feedback. And certainly in this group, although our team is very strong, there are some areas that might indicate more of a developmental program initiative that would help overall performance when it comes to providing communication feedback.